of the internet today in terms of speed and what rural internet is actually capable of. Hope you're having yourself a great day. Thanks a lot for tuning in here today to RealAg Live that we are broadcasting every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Mountain. We're going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of having an external guest of Real Agriculture, I brought in some of the gang. Brought in Lyndsey Smith and Kelvin Heppner. Lyndsey, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing well. I mean, this is a little embarrassing that everything goes wrong, and I feel like I'm somehow responsible because I do usually wreck things, technically.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far, but yeah, sure. If you want to take the blame, we will, both fingers are pointed at you then.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Hey, Kelvin, how are you doing?
Doing well here too. I think it's a little bit funny that this is happening when we're on the panel, but that's how things roll, and we just adjust and keep going.
It could be worse. It could be worse.
It could be worse.
Hey,
sure.
Gang, let's jump into what Agriculture Minister Marie-Claude Bebeau said yesterday. Lyndsey, you were on that call where she talked about the fact that the carbon tax costs assigned to grain drying were insignificant to warrant the exemption. What is she talking about?
Well, I'll be honest. I was on the Zoom call and I'm watching and I'm trying to take notes and all these sorts of fun things. And the actual Zoom conference call was about, trying to get an intake going for another funding project. And the first question out of the gate was, we were supposed to have the provincial meeting, and we were supposed to talk about this carbon tax. We were supposed to talk about, are we going to have an exemption? And really just sort of an off-the-cuff comment that sort of completely stopped me in my tracks, and that basically saying that according to AAFC crunching the numbers, what farmers pay in carbon tax on grain drying is not a significant enough percentage of operating costs for it to really be eligible for the exemption. So that in and of itself, I think anyone who went through the harvest from hell last fall, here in Ontario, we had a terrible harvest season, just so many grain dryers going flat out. I think that's really hard to hear for anyone who had to use it. And this was also the first time, and now this is just what I heard and sort of the perception that I got, but it was definitely the first time that I heard the minister use the price on pollution sort of so closely tied to a practice. And I really did get the sense that it was sort of they viewed grain drying in some sort of negative light. And I don't know, I want to dig into this a little bit more. I want to try and figure out what it's all about. But I really got the sense that it sort of was if we average it out over all the grain farmers, it wasn't really that much money. And that might be true, but realistically, it's not every grain farmer that has to dry grain every year. This is when disaster strikes, when you have a terrible year. This can mean the difference between taking a crop in and being able to store it safely and having nothing. So it feels like once again, here we are, and everyone at home should see my hands flailing, but you can't. But, here we are again with trying to struggle to explain, the challenges of agriculture and farming to this federal department, and just feels like we're banging our head against the wall.
Kelvin, was this not like an easy win for the government to just go along with this exemption on grain drying costs? Like, why are they treating this as if it's some bigger thin edge of the wedge for them in terms of caving on their climate policy?
I think that's exactly what it is. It's an ideological issue, Shaun, not so much financial or bean counting type of issue. They themselves, the minister used the word insignificant in terms of what it's going to cost. So you could turn that around and say it's going to bring in insignificant revenues for government and have an insignificant impact on emissions in terms of keeping this tax on grain drying. So I don't know. To me, it's an issue of where numbers and statistics can be formatted in a way that shows whatever argument you want to make. As Lyndsey alluded to, we don't quite know exactly what the bottom number, what the denominator is when they're talking about the number of dollars this is costing per farm across Canada, but they use the figure of an average for Canadian farms was $210 to $819 per farm. Well, why are they dividing it over all farms? Why not just farms that have grain dryers? It would be a much more significant number then. It wouldn't look nearly as insignificant. So to me, it's the way they've done the math makes it look like a much smaller number than what it is. On a farm with a grain dryer, it's certainly significant. And then the other thing is they're calculating it as a percentage of overall operating costs. They're talking about it only accounting for 0.05% to 0.42% of total farm operating expenses. Well, we know farming is a high-cost business. You have to invest 90 cents to make a dollar kind of thing. So why not talk about it in terms of net income, the impact it's having there instead of overall costs? So, yeah, it's to me, they knew this is the conclusion they wanted to get to, and they just used numbers that help support that argument.
Okay, so if that's the case, if they knew the answer previously to yesterday, and I don't think a lot of us are shocked the exemption didn't go forward, this gets back to my initial, like some of my criticism I've had is, why not just say no 6 months ago? Why go through this, dog and pony show, APAS coming up with data? We had CAP providing some data. I believe that CFA in general provided some data, Western wheat growers. Why go through all of that?
Some of the provinces.
Yeah, they made everybody just run around and scatter and come up, get out their calculators if there really was no intention of ever providing the exemption in the first place. What do you think about that, Kelvin?
I think that's, from a political strategy perspective, that's the way that I think politicians often handle things when they don't want to act on something. And then here we are in the middle of a pandemic where the news cycle is completely dominated by COVID and all the impacts from COVID. And it's not even kind of mentioned as an aside in a press conference. Fortunately, people like Lyndsey noticed it and have brought this information forward. But it's been a long time coming. This is really even the first time that we've heard Minister Bibeau and federal officials use actual numbers when they're talking about the impact of whether the numbers are legit or not, or up for interpretation. It's one of the first times they've actually put numbers to the effect that the carbon tax will have on agriculture and non-farms.
Yeah. Brian Voth through Facebook says, insert comment about this government and being insignificant, and then an emoji with the eyes looking to the corner. So I think there's a lot of people that kind of feel that way, Brian, for sure. So Lyndsey, earlier today I interviewed Dr. Carrie Holland, and she put out a report through the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. And it's all tied around, I think, a couple things. It's entitled, Canada's Food Security and Agri-Food Industry Critical to Our Post-COVID Economic Recovery, new report from the School of Public Policy. It ties very closely to what I talked about yesterday on RealAg Radio about some of the industry groups taking out that advertorial in the Globe and Mail, talking about how agriculture can lead us out of this. It could be one of the spearheading industries to lead Canada out of this economic disaster based on COVID, if you will let us. What do you think about those two things being so closely tied together? And is that a message that Canadian voters and consumers can wrap their head around, Linz?
Well, I think realistically, for any of it to be accomplished, that is what has to happen. So, I think within the agriculture industry, that discussion on food security, on food processing, on value added, this isn't new necessarily within agriculture. This has been one of those things for decades, really. It's why do we export so many raw products? Why don't we add value at home? And I do think that we've made progress. I do think that we've got some industries that definitely added process. We had more here. I do like and fully support sort of as an industry starting to see some of these pieces come together to really put some oomph behind some of these ideas. But realistically, let's it's a good segue from just our last conversation that if for any of this moving Canada from exporting commodities and raw products through to being not just food secure for ourselves, but also being a superpower to export to the world, It's going to take leadership within the industry, which I think we have, but it also is going to take provincial governments, federal government, actually backing this as well. And from the conversation we just had, is this current government the government that's really going to get behind that idea and this industry? And really, without the push coming from voters from outside of agriculture and putting that pressure on this current federal government, we can publish all sorts of papers and have really great ideas and conversations, but there has to be the political will, and that's clearly can't come from agriculture because it's already there, and that's not really getting us anywhere.
Viren sends a message through YouTube. He says, there's a lot of wordsmithing that goes on in government to begin with, but it seems like more so with this government. So, Kelvin, one of the things in this report put out by Dr. Holland, and you can hear my conversation with her today on RealAg Radio on Rural Radio 147 at 4:30 Eastern. How about that segue? She has 3 recommendations, okay? 1, additional financial assistance for farmers more in proportion to the costs they've incurred due to supply chain disruptions. 2, the federal government maintains pressure on trading partners to ensure trade agreements are upheld and borders remain open. And 3, Canada follows the direction outlined by recent government studies that have suggested greater investment in value-added processing. Do any of those, Kelvin, seem out of line?
I guess it compares or depends on which context or which comparison you want to base it on. If you look to the U.S., of course, their farmers have received a large cash injection as a result of COVID programming there, which we haven't seen in Canada. We've basically just seen increased lending access for farms, increased debt for the opportunity. I think most farmers aren't looking for whether that's an e-transfer, direct deposit, however it works these days. But I think the investment, or at least facilitation, support, creating an environment that's supportive for trade, for increased exports, and also for increased value added at home. That makes sense. Whether government needs to be directly involved, we've seen many projects where the government has been too involved in private operations. And government in that area and investment in that area, but what it should look like, I'm not sure. I know government is also talking about investing in already infrastructure projects, and I think there are some ideas down that, and I think that that would help as well. So, for example, Ralph Goodale in Saskatchewan who was Justin Trudeau's right-hand man until the last election. He's been championing an irrigation network in Saskatchewan, which would boost crop yields in a large part of the province, and I think that sort of would have a major economic benefit, that sort of idea. So,
yeah. But
I understand the sound. We're having some technical issues again.
Yeah, all of a sudden I got a little choppy. I'm just trying to correct it, so just bear with me here trying to fix it. Just hold on. So...
Here, Kelvin.
Yeah. Let me see here. Question from what I got here. Jim Hale says, considering the bulk of agricultural areas didn't elect this government, and I think that's something that we can be spiteful about it, but it's the reality. Is that I think rural Canada is having a hard time getting some of its issues noticed or heard. I was encouraged this week when I heard the fact that Minister Monsef was talking about how they're going to have a rural internet infrastructure fund that they were going to be providing some funding to. I think rural broadband is a major issue that could really use some help, and I don't care if it's a Liberal government or Conservative government, it needs to be a priority. But I think on the whole, outside of some of that topic, it really has been a struggle. And the reality is, no, rural Canada did not vote for this government. And so if the shoe is on the other foot and rural Canada elected another political party of a different political persuasion, it would just be the other side of the equation, and then we'd have maybe urban people squawking at that government. So that's kind of politics at work. Sorry, Kelvin, go ahead.
How can the farm community and agriculture exert leverage? Where do we get that leverage from then? Because that's the only way that we're going to become a higher priority.
Well, yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think that's why I think it gets back to my example I gave on the advertorial that those industry groups have taken out in the Globe is like, okay, let's create a positive message about some of the things the industry is doing. Let's try to help you understand, Canadian urban voter, what this industry, what it actually contributes to the economy. It is not, agriculture is not this romantic thing you remember from the 20s. Agriculture is a highly sophisticated contributor to the Canadian economy. It creates jobs. It provides infrastructure. It is a contributor through exports, feeding the world. They used a lot of different keywords and items to really, I think, not only attract urban centrists, but also some people that maybe had some total misconceptions of what the sector is about. And probably we just take for granted maybe a little bit how much people actually understand about the industry. No different than, if you ask people from agriculture how much they understand about oil and gas, right? It's all around me.
Oh, wow.
I'm in Alberta. Oil and gas is all around me. I don't understand any of it. And nobody would assume that I know anything about it. And so for some reason in farming, we sometimes we get upset that nobody understands us. Well, of course they don't. They got their own lives to live. Lyndsey, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say I thought everyone in Alberta had their own oil well. I thought that's literally how it worked. So
contrary to popular belief, no.
So, but Kelvin's point about how do we leverage, what we do offer into as far as, priorities and making it more of a priority for governments and support. I guess my question is when we talk about, the potential within agriculture and what we want to do, and we talk about that investment and it doesn't have to be government. Maybe it's that government just enables policy to encourage that investment. We still have to figure out where that money comes from. So, is that going to come from Canadians? Is that going to come from outside Canada? I mean, that definitely has been one of the discussions that, if we're talking about large-scale infrastructure projects and processing projects, isn't necessarily going to come from within Canada as far as the funding goes. And people would say no. And so we also have to balance, how would the average Canadian feel about, foreign investment in making some of these things happen. So I think we have to tread carefully to a degree. But I think that realistically as an industry, I mean, this is the whole disconnect between rural and urban, communicate between rural and urban has been a huge topic, especially for the past 8-10 years.
Yeah.
Probably very much so in the last bit. And how we really made any headway. And seeing the advertorial and seeing all those names there, I think that's a positive step. That's probably, it's getting into mainstream, it's working together, all those things. I think that's what we're going to have to see more of.
So Viren makes the comment, the government knows that no matter what they do or who's in power, farmers will get a crop in the ground and have a crop to sell. And Brian replies to that. We got some chat going back and forth, actually across platform, which is good. Brian says on Facebook, Viren, I agree with your comment, and knowing farmers will get a crop in the ground and have a crop to sell, they likely also realize someone will always farm the acreage base. If farms go bankrupt, another farm will swallow it up. That's an interesting way to look at it. Viren responds, being 2% of the vote doesn't help either. Man, the audience here is, I think, kind of speaking the truth here, Kelvin, a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And 2% of the votes, and what percentage of that 2% did not vote for the current party in the last election. And so I think that's kind of why we are where we are, even though if we had a different color of flag in Ottawa, I'm not sure that things would be all that different, because sometimes then the agriculture community gets taken for granted on the other side of things. So but that is a good point about those tax revenues will be there, whether having more farms fewer farms is a priority or not, those tax dollars will still be coming from the land base.
So, let's use the airline example. Okay, so there's been a huge debate about bailing out the airlines. And some countries like Germany have bailed out Lufthansa. The U.S. airlines are looking for some money as well. I think that package is like $60 billion. So here's in that example, the justification to bail out the airlines was that if we don't bail out the airlines, we're going to see other people come into the market and try to fly planes and run an airline in the U.S. or in Canada, but they're going to be Chinese owned. Right? That's where the capital is going to come to fund these new airlines. You could probably say the same thing for agriculture, right? As we have more and more consolidation, that land starts to transfer in ownership, how much of our own agricultural productive land are we willing to allow to be foreign owned? I think that's a question that doesn't come up enough, Lyndsey.
So no, so within the agricultural community, there would be many people who would say, absolutely not. We want Canadians to own and farm the land, because of course we do have many people that own the land that don't farm it. We definitely have, landlords, but then we've also got funds and investment funds that do. And certainly there's pushback on those as well. But I mean, yes, realistically, farmland for the most part is limited. Who is farming it? Do we, as a country, have an idea of what we want that to look like and how we support the model we want it to be? Because yes, the economics will take care of themselves. Someone will farm that land, but you might not like the setup that ends up in place when it's a nameless or a faceless fund that just hires a manager as opposed to an owner-operator farming that land, or it's foreign ownership because they're securing what they need going forward. So, to what as a country, as a nation, what do we value and what do we want to see agriculture look like? And I think we're seeing some of that from the ideological perspective, but I don't know that we're seeing it from the business perspective, saying, if we want vibrant and thriving and successful farms, what do we need for that? I think there's a certain level of, we've got other things to worry about.
So we've kind of been, I'm not going to say we've been negative about this, Kelvin, but we have to wrap our heads around, this is the reality. And if we're 2% of the population today, we're likely not going to turn that around and all of a sudden, 20 years from now be 4% of the population. That seems, I'm not sure how that's possible. So we know we're on the decline. So this is a problem that's not going away. So what are those solutions for us to be effective and have some leverage, some clout, some influence as our percentage of the population declines? How are we going to do that?
Well, the one line that I've often heard from farmers is that will only happen when people go hungry. And here we've gone through a pandemic where we've seen some shocks to the food supply chain. I would argue that the food supply chain has been very resilient in terms of maintaining food supplies and a vast variety of food and diverse variety of food across Canada and North America. But it would be something like this that could potentially raise the priority level on where our food comes from. And there has been some increased discussion in the last month or two about where Canadian food comes from and how it's produced. And maybe that, I'm optimistic that Shaun, is a step in the right direction in terms of awareness and an understanding of the issues and why some things should be a priority when it comes to Canadian agriculture and where the food that all Canadians eat, ultimately we all have that connection to agriculture. And I guess we just need to continue beating that drum and pushing uphill, it feels like some days, not always, but I think we've got to just keep that going.
Jim Hale on Facebook says, foreign capital will buy land that's cheap. Anyone buying land at a premium now is local. Interesting observation there from Jim out of Lancer, Saskatchewan. So, Kelvin, would you say that awareness of the food production system is one of the maybe there's limited benefits of the COVID-19 crisis. It's been a terrible issue that the world has had to battle. But is that one of maybe the positive outcomes, is that people became a little bit more aware of where food came from, not just the fact that it is at the grocery store?
Certainly. That's definitely a silver lining when it comes to whether it's conversations about how meat gets from a farm or a feedlot to the grocery store, the deli counter, or whether we're talking about people preparing food at home. I think that's certainly one of the biggest silver linings of this pandemic in terms of people kind of getting back to the basics as to what's important.
Lyndsey, would you agree? Would you agree with that?
Ish, in that I am hopeful that that's the case, but humans are incredibly fickle, and I think there is some momentum in this direction. I'm just not sure how much velocity is behind it, in that, you know, depending on how reopening of the economy goes, and I know the West is further ahead than we are on some things, as far as Ontario goes. I suppose it depends on what the second wave looks like, because certainly I see, you know, anecdotally and around here, and even for our own farm, there's been a lot more uptake in you know, buying direct from farmers, and the farmers markets have started opening up, and they've been incredibly busy, and people really are, you know, a whole bunch of people got backyard chickens and, you know, all these sorts of things. And it's like on some level, these are all very good things, and that, you know, there definitely is more of an awareness of food that, you know, in our backyard, and how it makes it to market, and how complex our value chain is in getting things to the grocery store. But realistically, you know, if, let's say, reopening goes well and we plateau and then we get a vaccine and we sort of, you know, COVID-19 becomes this awful nightmare that we wake up from, does that continue? I don't know. I do actually think, you know, how things play out over the next 6 months to 18 months could potentially change that relationship with food in our food system, maybe. So I think it's positive momentum. I just don't know how we keep it up.
You know, when we're in the moment, we tend to think that this is the point of change. Like this is the line in the sand. This is the event that is going to change the narrative, and we're going to move past this, and it's going to be just so much more clear. People are going to have clarity, and we're not going to have to worry about this ever again. And then we get past the moment and we realize that people went back to their daily lives, and c'est la vie. We didn't make as much movement forward as we first thought. And I think that's, you know, human nature, is that once something starts to impact people, they're like the greatest activists on the face of the planet. The minute that there's no concern about meat on the grocery store shelf, we haven't heard anything in the last 2 weeks about small processors, right?
Yep.
It was all over the news. It's out of the news cycle, and that's maybe the kind of unfortunate. Maybe I'll, you know, pick on some of our media peers for that, but it's just kind of it's sort of the reality at this point. Now, Kelvin, I thought of something. Is that, you know, right now we have ag lobby groups that are pushing for agricultural issues with government. Now, sometimes there's rural issues that get sort of swept up in that, and rural broadband is a good example. In order to increase that 2% number just a little bit, to tick it up, what if we had more like rural lobby organizations? You know, organizations lobbying the government for rural-based issues that would include agriculture. Would that make us more effective?
I think that's the right idea, or the right line of thinking, Shaun. I'm not sure whether rural will get us that much further in terms of having that leverage in Ottawa or even in provincial legislatures, just because the rural population isn't growing either. And once again, when it comes to political support, rural Canada isn't the core support for the current federal government, at least. And going forward, basically any type of, well, it's already that situation where any party that forms government for Canada has to have urban support. So I think we need to look into cities and find more allies and common shared values and shared priorities with urban audiences. And again, that probably leads to more of an emphasis on food and priorities with the food supply and food security and those types of conversations.
Yeah, and you know what? I think, and there's people that follow polling extremely close. Like, it'd be great to have a conversation with Daryl Bricker about this from Ipsos. Is like that alignment in cities could be in the suburbs, right? It's likely, like I would think it's likely not in the downtown of Toronto or the downtown of Montreal. It's people that live in the suburbs of those cities that probably are the people we should be aligning with. You guys agree with that?
Well, I'd like to back it up a little bit and be like, when you say rural, all I can envision are like acreage owners and feel like they're just going to start lobbying that everyone has to go back to small squares. So I do think that maybe we're better and potentially suburbia, but I don't know. That in and of itself also has issues.
Kelvin, I know that you've read you and I have both read John Ibbotson's book on Stephen Harper. I know the suburbs were a key focus for them.
Yeah, and just to add to Lyndsey's point quickly, I'll gladly pull out the small square baler and sell those bales for $20 a bale or whatever it takes.
You do it.
But yeah, and you mentioned the Ibbotson book on Harper. Daryl Bricker has a new book out just about a month ago called Next, and it kind of talks about demographic trends in Canada and how businesses should position themselves. And as you mentioned, Shaun, there's a huge emphasis on suburban Canadians going forward. That's the fastest growing type of, residence where people are living, and immigrants to Canada are moving into suburbs. And of course, the emphasis or the kind of the center of gravity for Canada is shifting from Eastern Canada to more in the West, whether it's Calgary or Vancouver, and Asian-focused cultures. And so I think we need to be thinking ahead and looking for partnerships in those or kind of aligning agriculture and our policies with what's important in those demographic groups. Yeah.
I'm going to get to that book next. I'm reading right now a book on Russian spies. I got to finish that first, but I'm getting over to that one for sure. It's Bricker has some great thought. I think one of the unique things about that, in terms of, like you said, the power moving west, it's going to be interesting. Obviously, Western Canadians have a big chip on their shoulder about the East and transfer payments and things like that. As we do see more political power based on population movements come to Western Canada, and that sort of balances out a little bit, it'll be interesting to see how we'll see more of a rural-urban divide in provinces like Alberta, where traditionally it's just been rural across the board, right? We're going to see a little bit, and we had an NDP government in Alberta here not too long ago, so maybe that's just sort of, I think, a early example of the winds of change, although handily defeated in the last election, I should add. Apologize to everybody for the somewhat at times poor connections. That is why rural broadband needs to be fixed across this country to make things a little bit more fair, even for people in rural Canada versus our urban peers. This is another example of that. Glad you could all join us for that real life case study. Really, really do appreciate it. Tomorrow we're going to have Ann Wasco, the Gateway Livestock Exchange. We're talking beef markets here on RealAg Live. Lyndsey and Kelvin, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Shaun.
No problem, John.
Okay, we do RealAg Live every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern, 1 o'clock Mountain. Thank you very much, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we will chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.